The constable found her at dawn on March 17, 1891, sitting perfectly upright in her rocking chair by the window. Her hands were still moving, fingers dancing through the motions of needle and thread, but there was no fabric between them. No needle, no thread, just empty air and the rhythmic motion of a seamstress who'd forgotten to stop working. Ingrid Dahl's workshop in Bergen, Norway, told a story the young woman could no longer tell herself. 43 wedding dresses hung from every rafter and hook, each one more elaborate than the last. They were masterpieces of lace and silk, of impossible detail that would have taken months to complete. She'd sewn them all in 11 nights. The dresses weren't the disturbing part, though they should have been. It was what she'd stitched into the hems, hundreds of tiny words in thread so fine you needed a magnifying glass to read them. The same phrase, over and over, in a handwriting that wasn't quite hers. He's waiting at the altar. When Dr. Henrik Anderson examined her that morning, Ingrid's fingertips were raw and bleeding, worn down to exposed nerve. She hadn't blinked in 6 hours. She was still trying to sew. This is the story of what happens when the line between sleep and waking dissolves completely, and when the mind, desperate to process trauma it cannot face, finds other ways to scream. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of historical mystery, to the stories that blur the boundary between psychological breakdown and something we can't quite explain, then subscribe and join us as we piece together what happened to Ingrid Dahl in those 11 impossible nights. Bergen, Norway, 1890. The wooden warehouses of Briggen leaned against each other like old friends sharing secrets, their colorful facades weathered by centuries of Atlantic storms. In a narrow workshop tucked between a fish merchant and a rope maker, Ingrid Dahl had built a reputation that drew clients from as far as Christiania. She was known for her precision. Brides would travel 3 days by coach just to have Ingrid craft their wedding dress because she understood something fundamental about the garments she created. A wedding dress wasn't just clothing. It was a promise made visible, a single, perfect day frozen in fabric and lace. Ingrid had learned the trade from her mother, who'd learned it from her grandmother, stretching back through a lineage of women who'd understood that in Norway's long, dark winters, beauty was an act of defiance. She worked alone in her third-floor workshop, surrounded by bolts of imported silk and locally woven wool, by jars of pearl buttons and spools of thread in every shade imaginable. She was methodical to the point of ritual. Each morning at 7, she'd unlock her workshop door and light the oil lamps. She'd brew strong coffee on the small stove in the corner, then settle at her work table with whatever dress was currently in progress. She worked until 1 o'clock, broke for a simple lunch, then returned to her needle until the light failed around 5. Never later. Ingrid believed that tired eyes made careless stitches, and she'd never delivered careless work. Her clients loved her not just for her skill, but for her demeanor. She was quietly warm, with a gentle way of making nervous brides feel at ease during fittings. She'd pin and adjust fabric while asking about wedding plans, about family, about the future the bride imagined. She remembered details, the groom's profession, the church where the ceremony would be held, which hymns would be sung. A dress should fit the day, not just the body, she'd often say, her fingers flying through adjustments that seemed to require no conscious thought. By all accounts, Ingrid was content. She lived in a small apartment 2 streets from her workshop, attended services at St. John's Church every Sunday, and saved money with the methodical patience of someone who understood the value of independence. At 29, she'd received several marriage proposals but had declined them all politely. She had her work, she'd explain. She had her purpose. But if you looked closely, and few people did, you might have noticed something shifting in the autumn of 1890. Ingrid began arriving at her workshop earlier, sometimes before dawn. She started keeping the lamps burning later, working past her self-imposed deadline until the oil ran low. Clients who came for fittings remarked that she seemed distracted, that sometimes she'd stare at a dress for long minutes, as if seeing something in the fabric that wasn't quite there. Her neighbor, Fru Johansson, mentioned to the fish merchant's wife that she'd heard Ingrid's sewing machine running at odd hours, 2 in the morning, 4, once even at dawn. Perhaps she has an important commission? Fru Johansson suggested, but there was worry in her voice. What none of them knew yet was that Ingrid had stopped sleeping entirely. Not in the way of normal insomnia, where one tosses and turns and watches the hours crawl past. Ingrid would lie down in her bed each night at 10 o'clock, close her eyes, and 8 hours later would wake to find herself somewhere else entirely. Standing at her work table, sitting in her rocking chair, once even walking down the street in her nightgown, all without any memory of having moved. She'd begun to lose time. The first incident Ingrid could clearly identify happened on October 3rd, 1890. She remembered lying down to sleep, remembered the comfort of her quilts, and the sound of rain against her window. Then she was standing in her workshop, fully dressed, with a completed bodice laid out before her that she had no memory of creating. The stitching was hers. She recognized her own hand in the precise, even lines, but it was impossibly fine work, more detailed than anything she typically produced. She stood there for 20 minutes, studying the garment, trying to recall even a single moment of its creation. Nothing came. Ingrid told herself she must have sleepwalked, that stress and overwork had triggered some kind of fugue state. She'd heard of such things, though never experienced them herself. She resolved to rest more, to perhaps take a day away from the workshop. But the episodes continued, and they escalated. 3 nights later, she woke to find herself in her rocking chair, her lap full of lace she'd apparently been tatting in her sleep. A week after that, she came to consciousness while walking down the midnight street, a bundle of fabric clutched to her chest, her feet bare on the cold cobblestones. Each time, there was work. Always work. Dresses in various stages of completion that she couldn't remember starting. Embroidery so intricate it should have taken days, finished in hours she couldn't account for. Ingrid began to fear her own mind. She started keeping a journal, documenting each episode with the clinical precision she usually reserved for measuring hems. October 11th, lost 4 hours, woke standing, created sleeve assembly. October 15th, lost entire night, found 3 completed skirt panels. Work quality, excellent, but cannot recall any of it. The most disturbing part wasn't the lost time itself, it was the quality of the work she was producing. During her unconscious hours, Ingrid's hands created pieces that surpassed anything she made while awake. The stitches were smaller, more precise. The design choices were bolder, more innovative. It was as if someone more skilled had borrowed her body, her hands, her tools. She consulted Dr. Anderson in late October, speaking carefully, trying not to sound mad. The doctor was a rational man in his 50s who'd studied in Edinburgh and brought modern medical thinking to Bergen's more traditional practices. He listened to her description with furrowed brow, asked about her sleep habits, her diet, her family history. Somnambulism, he declared finally. Sleepwalking, though your case is unusual in its complexity. The mind sometimes continues certain habitual tasks during sleep, particularly in individuals with strong professional routines. I've read of bakers who've kneaded dough in their sleep, of clerks who've organized papers. He prescribed warm milk before bed, lavender sachets for her pillow, and a reduction in her working hours. You've overtrained your hands, he explained. They continue their motion even when your conscious mind rests. Cut back on your commissions, get more fresh air, and this should resolve itself. Ingrid tried to follow his advice. She turned away new clients, forced herself to leave the workshop by 3 each afternoon, took long walks along the harbor. For a few nights, it seemed to help. The episodes became less frequent, less intense. Then everything changed. On November 8th, 1890, a young woman named Sina Larson came to Ingrid's workshop for a fitting. She was to be married on December 20th, and Ingrid had been crafting her wedding dress since September, a relatively simple design in cream wool with modest lace trim at the cuffs and collar. Sina arrived for her final fitting at 2 in the afternoon, Ingrid remembered her coming through the door, remembered helping her into the dress, remembered pinning a small adjustment at the waist. Then there was nothing. When Ingrid's consciousness returned, it was dark outside. The workshop was lit by every lamp she owned, burning bright enough to hurt her eyes. Sina was gone, and hanging on the dress form, where the simple wool gown should have been, was something else entirely. The dress had been transformed. The modest lace trim had been replaced by elaborate panels of handmade lace, so fine it looked like frozen breath. The simple collar had become a high Victorian neckline with dozens of tiny pearl buttons. The hem, previously plain, now featured hand-embroidered flowers in white silk thread, roses, lilies, forget-me-nots, each one botanically perfect. It was the most beautiful wedding dress Ingrid had ever seen. It was also wrong. Wrong for Sina. Wrong for a December wedding in Bergen. Wrong for a fishing family's modest celebration. It was a dress for someone else entirely, for some wedding that existed only in Ingrid's fractured mind. She stood there shaking, understanding with sudden clarity that something inside her had broken beyond Dr. Anderson's warm milk and lavender sachets. This wasn't simple sleepwalking. This was something else. This was the beginning of the end. After the incident with Sina Larsson's dress, Ingrid made a decision that would prove catastrophic. She told no one. She couldn't explain what had happened, how she'd lost 6 hours, how she'd transformed a simple dress into something elaborate without any conscious memory. More importantly, she couldn't afford to lose her reputation. Word traveled fast in Bergen's tight-knit community. If people thought she was unreliable, or worse, unstable, her business would collapse. So she lied. When Sina returned 2 days later for the completed dress, Ingrid explained that she'd been inspired to add enhancements, that she hoped Sina wouldn't mind the extra details at no additional charge. Sina was overwhelmed with gratitude, tearfully declaring it the most beautiful gown she'd ever seen. Ingrid accepted the praise with a smile that felt like glass breaking inside her, but the episodes were worsening, and they were changing. November brought a pattern that Ingrid began to document with increasing desperation. She would go to bed each night in her apartment, and each morning she would wake in her workshop, surrounded by evidence of hours of frenzied activity, dresses in various stages of completion, patterns drawn on paper in handwriting that was almost, but not quite, hers. Most disturbing of all, notes. The notes were written in Norwegian, but in a strange, cramped script that hurt to read. They contained instructions for dress construction, measurements, fabric recommendations, elaborate design details. At first, Ingrid thought she must be writing them herself during her episodes, some kind of unconscious planning. But then she began to notice something that made her blood run cold. The notes referenced dresses for women who weren't her clients. Anna's dress needs deeper blue, one note read. She'll want to match her mother's eyes. Ingrid didn't know any Anna. Another note. Elizabeth won't admit it, but she's carrying, so leave room in the waist. She'd never met an Elizabeth. Most chilling of all, the notes sometimes referenced wedding dates, and when Ingrid checked the church records, she found that women with those names had indeed been married on those dates. 20 years ago, 30 years ago. One dated back to 1852, 16 years before Ingrid was born. She was sewing dresses for ghosts. December brought physical deterioration. Ingrid's hands, once steady and sure, developed a tremor. Her fingers began to bleed from overwork. The skin worn away by endless hours of pushing needle through fabric. She lost weight. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, so deep they looked like bruises. Dr. Anderson, seeing her at church one Sunday, pulled her aside with concern. You look unwell, Ingrid. Have you been following my recommendations? I'm sleeping less well, she admitted, which was perhaps the greatest understatement of her life. He prescribed chloral hydrate, a sedative that was becoming popular for treating insomnia. Take 1 teaspoon before bed, he instructed. It will give you deep, dreamless sleep. That's what you need. Ingrid took the chloral hydrate that very night. She measured out a careful teaspoon, mixed it with water, and drank it down. The effect was almost immediate, a heavy warmth spreading through her limbs, her thoughts becoming slow and thick. She barely made it to bed before unconsciousness claimed her. She woke 16 hours later, not in her bed, but in her workshop, to discover she'd completed 3 entire dresses while heavily sedated. The medication hadn't stopped her. It had only taken away her ability to partially surface, to have even brief moments of awareness during her episodes. She'd been completely unconscious, chemically suppressed, and still her hands had worked. This was when Ingrid began to understand something terrible. Whatever was driving her wasn't psychological. Or rather, it wasn't only psychological. There was a compulsion in her body itself, in her hands, that operated independent of her conscious or even unconscious mind. Her hands wanted to sew, needed to sew, would sew whether she willed it or not. She threw away the chloral hydrate. January 1891 brought the worst development yet. Ingrid realized that her episodes weren't random. They were being triggered by something specific. Every time she spoke with a bride-to-be, every time she took measurements or discussed wedding plans, she would lose hours afterward, sometimes days. The conversation with the bride would unlock something, and that night, Ingrid's body would wake without her and begin creating a dress. Not the dress she'd been commissioned to make, but some other dress, some phantom garment for a wedding that had already happened, or might never happen at all. Her workshop began to fill with unclaimed dresses, beautiful, perfect dresses that no one had ordered and no one would come to collect. She hung them from every available space, hooks on the walls, rafters, suspended on lines of rope across the ceiling. They swayed in the drafts like hanged women in silk and lace. Fru Johansson, bringing by a loaf of bread one afternoon, stepped into the workshop and gasped, "Ingrid, dear God, what is all this?" "Commissions," Ingrid lied, but her voice had gone flat, automatic. Many commissions. She was losing the ability to distinguish truth from fabrication, waking from sleeping, work from compulsion. The boundaries of herself were dissolving. On March 1st, 1891, Ingrid made her final entry in her journal. "I am afraid I am disappearing. The seamstress who sews is becoming more real than the woman who once chose to sew. Soon there will be only the work, and I will be gone." She was right. What happened next was witnessed by several people, though their accounts varied in detail. What remained consistent was the timeline. 11 nights of impossible activity that would become Bergen's most disturbing, unsolved mystery. It began on March the 6th, 1891, when Pastor Olson of St. John's Church encountered Ingrid walking through the graveyard at 3 a.m. She was in her nightgown, barefooted despite the March cold, carrying an armful of white fabric. The pastor approached with concern, placing a hand on her shoulder. Ingrid turned to him, and the pastor would later tell the constable that her eyes were open but seeing nothing. She didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't respond to her name. She simply walked past him, through the graveyard gate, and disappeared into the darkness. The pastor, disturbed but not wanting to forcibly restrain a congregant, mentioned the incident to Dr. Anderson the next morning. The doctor went immediately to Ingrid's workshop. He found her there, working. She was seated at her table, sewing with mechanical precision, and initially seemed perfectly normal. But as Dr. Anderson spoke to her, asking about her health, her sleep, whether she'd been taking walks at night, he realized something was profoundly wrong. Ingrid responded to his questions, but her answers were delayed by several seconds, as if they had to travel a great distance to reach her mouth. Her hands never stopped moving. "I'm quite well, doctor," she said, but her voice was flat, affectless. "Ingrid, when did you last sleep?" A long pause. "Tuesday, I believe." It was Friday. Dr. Anderson tried to convince her to come with him, to rest at his surgery where he could observe her properly. She refused with quiet firmness, explaining that she had work to complete, dresses to finish. He couldn't legally compel her to come, and she wasn't technically doing anything wrong. He left, but asked the constable to check on her daily. That night, the impossible work began. Over the next 11 days, witnesses reported seeing Ingrid at all hours, always carrying fabric, always in motion. The fish merchant saw her at dawn, climbing the stairs to her workshop with bolts of silk that no one remembered delivering. Fru Johansson heard the sewing machine running continuously, day and night, the rhythmic clatter never pausing. A dock worker swore he saw her on the roof of her building at midnight, hanging dresses on a line that wasn't there. But it was what accumulated inside her workshop that defied explanation. The constable, checking on her each day as Dr. Anderson had requested, watched the dresses multiply. On March 7th, there were 12. On March 9th, 23. By March 13th, the workshop was filled wall to wall with wedding dresses, 43 in total, each one more elaborate than any Ingrid had created in her entire career. They were masterworks. That was what made it so disturbing. These weren't the frenzied scrawls of madness, they were the pinnacle of craftsmanship, each dress showing techniques that should have taken months to master and execute. Hand-tatted lace collars with patterns so complex they seemed mathematical. Embroidered trains with narrative scenes, churches, flowers, birds in flight. One dress had 700 pearl buttons, each one hand-sewn with invisible thread. The constable tried to engage Ingrid in conversation during his visits, but she barely acknowledged his presence. She would be standing at her work table, or sitting in her rocking chair by the window, or sometimes simply standing in the center of the room surrounded by her creations. Always, her hands were moving, pinning, cutting, sewing, even when there was nothing in them. Dr. Anderson visited again on March 14th, bringing a colleague from Christiania, a specialist in mental disorders. Together, they observed Ingrid for 2 hours. She never stopped working. She never ate. They offered her water, which she drank without seeming to notice the glass or their presence. Her hands continued their motion even while she drank. "It's as if she's automated," the specialist whispered. "The body continues its learned function, independent of conscious will." "But for how long?" Dr. Anderson asked. "She'll collapse soon. She must." She didn't. On March 16th, 11 days after the episodes began, the shop girl from the dressmaker down the street brought Ingrid's landlord to the workshop. The rent was overdue, and the landlord wanted to discuss payment. They found Ingrid standing before her wall of dresses, swaying slightly, her hands making the motions of sewing in empty air. The landlord spoke to her. She didn't respond. The shop girl touched her arm. Ingrid's head turned slowly, mechanically, but her eyes focused on nothing. There was no one home behind those eyes. They summoned Dr. Anderson immediately. By the time the doctor arrived in the early evening of March 16th, a small crowd had gathered outside Ingrid's workshop. Word had spread through Briggen about the seamstress who hadn't stopped working for nearly 2 weeks, who'd created dozens of impossible dresses, who'd become something other than human. Dr. Anderson pushed through the crowd and climbed the stairs to Ingrid's workshop. He found her exactly where she would be when the constable discovered her the next morning, sitting in her rocking chair by the window, hands moving through the motions of sewing, surrounded by 43 perfect wedding dresses that no one had commissioned and no one would ever wear. But now, in the fading light of March 16th, she was still awake, if awake was the word for whatever state she inhabited. "Ingrid," Dr. Anderson said gently, "can you hear me?" Her lips moved, a whisper, barely audible. He's waiting at the altar." "Who's waiting, Ingrid?" "He's waiting at the altar." The same words, the same flat tone. That was when Dr. Anderson noticed the hems of the dresses nearest to him. He knelt, bringing an oil lamp closer, and saw what the constable would discover the next morning. Tiny words, sewn in white thread on white fabric, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them. "He's waiting at the altar." Hundreds of times, in every hem of every dress, the same phrase repeated until it became a prayer, a mantra, a scream, rendered in thread. Dr. Anderson stayed with her through the night, documenting what he witnessed. Ingrid never slept. Her hands never stopped moving. Around 3 a.m, she began to hum. A wedding march, he realized. The same few bars repeated endlessly. At dawn, on March 17th, something inside her finally, irreversibly broke. She was still sitting in her chair, but her hands had slowed, then stopped, then begun moving again in empty air without fabric or thread. Her eyes were open, but saw nothing. She was sewing dresses for ghosts in a workshop that had become her tomb. This was how the constable found her when he arrived for his daily check. A woman who'd forgotten how to be anything except the thing she'd done too well for too long. Dr. Anderson arranged for Ingrid to be admitted to Kalfarvayan Asylum on the morning of March 18th. She didn't resist. She couldn't resist. She had to be carried to the wagon, still making the motions of sewing with her ruined hands, still humming fragments of wedding marches that no one else could quite place. The asylum sat on a hill overlooking Bergen, a gray stone building that promised treatment, but more often delivered simple containment. Dr. Anderson had privileges there, though, and he ensured Ingrid was placed in a private room with windows overlooking the fjord. He hoped that rest, proper nutrition, and distance from her workshop might allow her mind to heal. For 3 weeks, there was no change. Ingrid sat by her window, making the endless motion of sewing invisible fabric. She had to be fed, bathed, moved to prevent bed sores. She acknowledged no one, responded to nothing. The only sign of mental activity was the humming. Always wedding marches, always the same few bars, repeated until the nurses wanted to scream. Dr. Anderson visited daily, trying various approaches. He'd speak to her about neutral topics, about the weather, about birds on the windowsill. No response. He'd ask about her family, her childhood, her mother who taught her to sew. Nothing. He tried bringing fabric, offering her needle and thread, hoping that actual work might anchor her back to reality. This produced the most disturbing response yet. When presented with needle and thread, Ingrid's face contorted in what might have been terror. She drew back, pressed herself against the wall, and for the first time since her admission, she spoke. "No more, please. No more." Then she fell silent again, returning to her invisible sewing with shaking hands. It was a nurse named Greta who made the first breakthrough. She'd been assigned to Ingrid's care and had taken a particular interest in the young woman's case. On April 9th, while helping Ingrid dress for the day, Greta began to hum. Not a wedding march, that would have been cruel, but an old folk song, a child's lullaby that most Norwegian women knew. Ingrid's hands stopped moving. Greta froze, afraid she'd done something wrong, but then Ingrid's mouth opened, and in a thin, exhausted voice, she began to sing the words, "Row, row till Fiskeskär row, row to fishing grounds." She sang one verse, then fell silent. But her eyes, for the first time in weeks, seemed to focus on something real. She looked at Greta, and Greta could see that someone was home behind those eyes, even if just barely, even if just for a moment. "Ingrid," Greta whispered, "are you there?" "I'm so tired," Ingrid breathed, and then she began to cry. Dr. Anderson was summoned immediately. Over the next several days, with Greta's help, he was able to coax fragments of lucidity from Ingrid. It was like watching someone surface from deep water, gasping for air, then sinking again. She would be present for a few minutes, able to answer simple questions, able to acknowledge her surroundings. Then something would shift, and she'd return to her rocking motion, her hands working invisible thread. During her lucid moments, Dr. Anderson tried to understand what had happened. "Ingrid, can you tell me why you were making all those dresses?" "For the wedding," she'd murmur. "Whose wedding?" A long silence. Then, in a voice like breaking ice, "Mine." This was the first piece of the puzzle. Over several sessions, Anderson extracted the story bit by bit, fragment by fractured fragment. Ingrid had been engaged once, 6 years ago, to a man named Thomas Henriksen. They'd planned to marry in December of 1885. Ingrid had sewn her own wedding dress, had poured months of work into creating something perfect. 3 weeks before the wedding, Thomas had been lost at sea. His fishing vessel had gone down in a November storm. No bodies were recovered. Ingrid had never worn the dress. She'd packed it away, never spoken of Thomas again, had buried her grief so deep that even she forgot it was there. But the body remembers what the mind refuses. "He's waiting at the altar," Ingrid whispered during one session. Tears streaming down her face. "I never came. He's still waiting." "Thomas is gone, Ingrid," Dr. Anderson said gently. "He's been gone 6 years." "I know." She looked at her ruined hands. "But I keep trying to finish the dress anyway. I keep trying to be ready. My hands won't stop trying to be ready for a day that already died." This was the mechanism of her madness, Dr. Anderson realized. Ingrid had trained herself so thoroughly in her craft, had bound her identity so completely to the act of sewing, that when trauma struck, her body continued the work independent of her will. The sleepwalking had been her unconscious mind trying to complete an impossible task, to be ready for a wedding that would never happen, to make perfect a day that had been destroyed. The 43 dresses were all variations of one dress, her wedding dress, remade again and again, each time hoping that this version would be the one that could resurrect the past, that could bring Thomas back from the depths. Understanding the mechanism didn't cure her, but it gave Dr. Anderson a framework for treatment. He began working with Ingrid to separate her identity from her craft, to build a self that existed independent of the work her hands could do. It was slow, painful progress. There were setbacks, days when Ingrid would retreat entirely into catatonia. But gradually, over months, she began to stabilize. By autumn of 1891, Ingrid could carry on conversations, could take walks in the asylum grounds, could spend hours not thinking about sewing. Her hands still sometimes moved through the remembered motions, but less frequently, and she could usually stop them when she noticed. Dr. Anderson proposed that she be released, perhaps to stay with family in the countryside, somewhere far from fabric and thread and the triggers that had destroyed her. Ingrid agreed. She never wanted to see a sewing machine again, but there was one last thing she needed to do. On October 15th, 1891, 7 months after her breakdown, Ingrid returned to her workshop one final time, accompanied by Dr. Anderson and Greta. The 43 dresses still hung there, untouched, slowly gathering dust. Her landlord had refused to enter, had left everything exactly as it was. Ingrid stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her phantom creations, and wept, quietly. Then, one by one, she took the dresses down. She folded each with care. She couldn't help that, it was trained too deep, and packed them into trunks. Dr. Anderson had arranged for them to be donated to various churches across Western Norway, to be given to poor brides who couldn't afford dresses of their own. At least, that was the plan. But when the churches received the dresses and examined them, they found the words sewn into every hem. "He's waiting at the altar." Most of the clergy, disturbed by what they perceived as either madness or dark magic, quietly burned the dresses rather than give them to young brides. Only 3 survived. They're housed now in Bergen's Museum of History, preserved behind glass, their hems carefully displayed so visitors can see the tiny, obsessive stitching that tells the story of a woman who worked until work became all she was. Ingrid Dahl never sewed again. She spent 2 more months at Kalfarveien Asylum, then moved to a small cottage in Voss, a mountain town 2 hours east of Bergen. She lived there for the next 43 years, until her death in 1934 at the age of 72. She worked in a bakery. She kept chickens. She learned to knit, though she could never commit to it with the intensity she'd once given to sewing. She'd learned that lesson too well. She had friends, attended church, lived a quiet life that never made the newspapers again. But Dr. Anderson's notes on her case did make an impact. He published a paper in 1892 titled Somnambulistic Automatism and Professional Identity, a Case Study, which detailed Ingrid's breakdown without using her real name. The paper was largely ignored in Norway, but caught the attention of emerging psychologists in Vienna and Paris who were beginning to explore the unconscious mind. Elements of Ingrid's case would echo through early psychological literature. The idea that identity could become trapped in repetitive behavior, that trauma could express itself through the body's learned skills. In 1920, a young journalist tracked down Ingrid and Voss and requested an interview. She was 58 by then, silver-haired and weathered by mountain winters. She agreed to speak to him, though she insisted on anonymity. The journalist asked her what she'd learned from her ordeal. "That excellence can kill you," Ingrid said quietly. "Not the pursuit of it, but the achievement. When you become too good at something, when you do it so well that people can't imagine you without it, you risk becoming only that thing. And if you're only one thing, what happens when that thing breaks you?" She looked at her hands, still scarred after 3 decades, the fingertips slightly flattened where nerve damage never fully healed. "I thought my work was an expression of who I was," she continued, "but the work had consumed who I was. When Thomas died, I had no way to grieve as Ingrid. I could only grieve as the seamstress, and the seamstress's way of grieving was to sew. So that's what I did, until there was nothing left but the sewing." The journalist asked if she ever missed it. The work, the precision, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. Ingrid smiled, a strange, sad expression. "Every day. But I don't trust that missing. I don't trust what would happen if I picked up a needle again. Some doors, once you close them, must stay closed." There's a final detail to Ingrid's story that didn't emerge until decades after her death. In 1956, researchers cataloging the Museum of History's collection took a closer look at the 3 surviving dresses from Ingrid's workshop. Using magnification and a careful examination, they discovered something that had gone unnoticed in 1891. The phrase sewn into the hems, "He's waiting at the altar," wasn't the only text hidden in the dresses. Scattered throughout the elaborate embroidery, worked into the patterns of lace and the flourishes of decorative stitching were other words. Dozens of them, so small and so artfully concealed that you'd never see them unless you were looking. They were pleas for help. "Please stop me. I can't stop. Someone help me stop. My hands won't stop. I don't want to sew anymore. Please, make it stop." Ingrid's unconscious mind, locked in its compulsive loop, had been crying out the entire time. The beautiful dresses that everyone admired were suicide notes written in a language no one thought to read. She'd been screaming for 11 nights, and all anyone saw was craftsmanship. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of her case, that we're often blind to the suffering hidden inside achievement. We see the product and assume the producer must be fulfilled. We mistake the ability to continue for the desire to continue. We confuse excellence with wellness. Ingrid Dahl's story isn't just about one woman's breakdown in 1891. It's about every person who's worked until work became an identity, then an obsession, then a prison. It's about the invisible line between passion and pathology, and how easily we cross it while everyone around us applauds. Her workshop in Bregan was eventually torn down in the 1920s during renovations to the historic district. Nothing remains of it now except photographs and Dr. Anderson's notes and 3 dresses behind glass in a museum, their hems still whispering the same desperate phrase. But perhaps Ingrid would prefer we remember not the 11 nights of madness, but the 14 years of peace that followed. The cottage in Voss, the chickens, the simple pleasure of bread baking, which she could do with care but not obsession, with skill but not compulsion. She learned finally to be something other than what her hands could make. She learned to rest, and in that rest, in that deliberate stepping back from the edge of her own excellence, she found the one thing her endless sewing could never create: a life worth living, even if it was no longer extraordinary, even if it was simply, blessedly, ordinarily her own.